Hi, my name's Ian. Welcome to the Early Christian Beliefs channel, and this is episode 3 of Contra Bandas. We are going to be looking at Monsignor Bandas's claims that one can harmonize the Bible in millions of years because the days of Genesis, meaning the first 6 days of creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, can be harmonized with millions of years because the church permits us to interpret the days of Genesis as long ages. We will compare Monsignor Bandas's claims to Pope St. Pius X's 1909 Holy Office letter that is written specifically about the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And also, we will be looking at what the early Christian fathers understood about the days of Genesis as long ages. And they have quite a bit to say about the days of Genesis as long ages. So the claims that we're going to specifically look at from Monsignor Bandas are as follows. Quote, "In the first place, the church has not defined the meaning of day in the Genesiac account of creation. Secondly, most Catholic exegetes maintain the term denotes an indefinite period of time." And there he's referring to the term day. So his 2 points are that the church has never defined the meaning of the word day, but at the same time, most Catholic exegetes, according to Monsignor Bandas, maintain that the term denotes an indefinite period of time. What I'm going to demonstrate to you is that the church has said much and with great specificity has defined that the days of creation, the 6 days of creation in Genesis, are 24-hour days, and that they also can be understood as very long periods of time, and that the fathers have said a great deal, far more than we can cover here today. I've made another video on this topic. It is linked in the show notes. But the fathers have said a great deal about the days of Genesis being long periods of time. We will briefly cover it, but long story short is that none of their understandings of Genesis days being long periods of time ever add any time to the chronology. It's always understood in a prophetic or in a spiritual sense to be a long period of time. But there is one exception that I have found, that a father is said in a secondhand account to understand the days of Genesis that would add a considerable amount of time to the biblical chronology, which in the early Christian time period was generally between 5,200 and 5,500 years from creation to Christ. So let's start out by looking at the 1909 response of the Biblical Commission on the historical character of the early chapters of Genesis. Question 1. Whether the various exegetical systems which have been proposed to exclude the literal historical sense of the 3 first chapters of the book of Genesis and have been defended by the pretense of science are sustained by a solid foundation. Reply in the negative. So obviously this directly contradicts everything that Monsignor Bandas is teaching. His whole premise is that, well, the science throws out the traditional teaching, and then at the same time he tries to argue that there never really was a traditional teaching. Here's what Monsignor Bandas says. In examining the formations and fossils in the strata of the earth, scientists conclude that it took millions of years for the universe to attain its present form and not 6 genesic days or 144 hours. Yet science is not necessarily in conflict with the book of Genesis on this point. So we see here that even though Monsignor Bandas is intent on denying the validity of the obvious reading, the historical sense, he clearly can see that it's 144 hours is what's being described in the book. But how has the church always understood it? Famous scriptural exegete Father Cornelius a Lapide writes in the 17th century, quote, "All this is to say that after the first illuminated time had run its course, which was 12 hours long, to the ensuing evening, the time of night ran its course up to the second illumination, which was also 12 hours in length. And so when the morning followed it, the first day of 24 hours was complete." And just in case you're wondering, Father Lapide is definitely talking about the first day of creation there. In the last episode, we discussed the fact that the fathers almost completely unanimously understood the Genesis days as 24 hours. Father Lapide is here repeating the same understanding, and he disregards the small percentage of writers who saw the days of creation as instantaneous and sees that now the only acceptable view is the 24-hour day. He writes, "However, all the other fathers teach a contrary opinion, and the simple and historical narrative prevails over the views of St. Augustine." So Father Lapide, the great scriptural exegete, is saying that the 24-hour day view is completely unanimous, which would make it binding on the conscience. But we're here to talk about the days of creation as long periods of time, which the fathers also understood. And if that seems contradictory, it's not surprising, especially because so much disinformation has been put out over the last 150 or so years by modernists as they have brought this great apostasy upon the church. Let us start our examination of the days as long ages by seeing what the Biblical Commission under Pius X defined for us. Question 8. Whether in that designation and distinction of 6 days with which the account of the first chapters of Genesis deals, the word dies can be assumed either in its proper sense as a natural day or in the improper sense of a certain space of time, and whether, with regard to such a question, there can be free disagreement among exegetes. Reply in the affirmative. So we can understand the word day in Genesis to mean a certain space of time other than a 24-hour day. And the Biblical Commission gives us further direction in question 6, where it says, presupposing the literal and historical sense, the allegorical and prophetical interpretation of some passages of the same chapters, with the example of the Holy Fathers and the Church herself showing the way, can be wisely and profitably applied. Reply in the affirmative. So we can interpret the word day as a certain space and time, as we've seen in question 8. And question 6 gives us further direction that we have to presuppose the literal and historical sense, and then we can look at the allegorical and prophetical interpretation with the fathers and the church showing the way. So let's look now at an example of a church father, who saw the days of Genesis as long periods of time and also saw them as 24-hour days. In the 3rd century, Saint Victorinus of Paetau, bishop and martyr, writes the following: God produced that entire mass for the adornment of his majesty in 6 days. In the beginning, God made the light and divided it in the exact measure of 12 hours by day and by night. So he is saying what the unanimous position of the church has always been, and what Father Lapide says is the unanimous position of the church. He goes on to say, regarding the day as long periods of time, the following, quote, that true and just Sabbath should be observed in the 7th millenary of years. Wherefore to those 7 days the Lord attributed to each 1,000 years. For thus went the warning, in your eyes, O Lord, 1,000 years are as 1 day. So this was the common teaching of the church, that each of the 24-hour creation days prophetically represented a 1,000-year period of world history, past, present, and future. For another example, let's look at St. Jerome, bishop and doctor of the church. He writes, 1,000 years in thy sight as yesterday. From this passage and from the epistle which is attributed to the Apostle Peter, I conclude that the custom comes of taking 1,000 years for 1 day, with the result, that is, that just as the universe was fashioned in 6 days, so one believes that it will last only 6,000 years, and that afterward will come the 7-fold and the 8-fold number, when the true Sabbath will be kept. So again, we see the understanding that creation of the universe was fashioned in 6 literal days, and that those 6 creation days are also understood as a certain period of time, namely 1,000 years. And this was such a common concept. It is all over the early Christian writings. Here's something a little more close to home for most of us. It's the reading from the Roman Breviary for December 25th. The Nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ, in the year from the creation of the world, when in the beginning God created heaven and earth, 5,199 years. In the 6th age of the world, Jesus Christ, eternal God, and Son of the eternal Father, so on and so forth. So here is that same concept that was there clear back to the 1st century, that each day of creation is recapitulated in world history. So the breviary here is expressing the view that there were 5,199 years from creation to Christ. So that is into the 6th millennia. And that's why it says further down, in the 6th age of the world. So this isn't some wacky early church idea. It's an eternal truth, and the church still holds it forth for the belief of the faithful today. So you'll notice that these examples I've given are looking forward in time prophetically. It didn't occur to any of these fathers to interpret the word day as a certain long period of time and add any time to the biblical chronology. And there's several other examples I could give you of different ways that people use the word day as a long period of time. But I think I've made the point sufficiently clear of how they used it. So it is not true that the fathers or the church ever taught that you could understand the word day to make the history of the universe any longer than the biblical chronologies that the church have always held forward as true. However, I may have found one father that is the exception to that rule. Now, in order for that to be true, first of all, you have to be willing to accept Origen of Alexandria as a father, which I think in a certain sense he is. He's very influential. But by the same token, he has also been the recipient of multiple condemnations throughout church history. Which brings me to the second condition here. You have to not only hold him as a father, but be willing to stand with him while he's condemned for using the word day to add time to the history of the world by a bishop and a martyr. And just for clarification, this condemnation was just a personal condemnation, not a council. And it's presented in a 9th century source, so it's third or fourth hand. But let's take a look at the one example in history I could find of anyone using the word day in Genesis to add any time to the biblical chronology. Methodius of Olympus allegedly says the following that Origen says, quote, "He says that Origen adds this also. Therefore, they say that an age of 6,000 years extends from Adam to our time. For they say that the judgment will come on the 7th day. That is, in the 7,000th year. Therefore, all the days from our time to that which was in the beginning, in which God created the heaven and the earth, are computed to be 13 days. This is what Origen says seriously, and mark how he trifles." End quote. So there you have it. That is the only example that I've ever been able to find of a early Christian, or any Christian, until the modernist revolution, taking the days of creation as a certain period of time and adding it to the total chronology. Here he's saying it's a total of 13 days, each equaling 1,000 years. So if I'm understanding it right, that would be the 6 days of creation, which he alone here would be allegedly interpreting as 6,000 years up to the creation of Adam, and then an additional 6,000 years, which would bring up to the time that they were in, the 3rd century, and then an additional 1,000 after that for the millennial reign. I believe that's what they're saying there. So a total of 13,000 years. Doesn't get you anywhere near Monsignor Bandas's billions and billions and trillions and whatever he's playing with. But this is the only example. Now, I haven't read every saint that has ever lived, but I'm quite confident that this is the only example, because if there was some saint who believed in millions of years and used the Genesis days to add this amount of time, well, the modernists would have heralded this person as so forward-thinking and broad-minded and so much more intelligent and so on and so forth. We'd know all about him. So The only example we have from actual history of the church addressing the issue of adding time to the biblical chronology by the use of the word day is a condemnation. Well, that wraps up this third episode of Contra Bandas. May God bless you, and I'll talk to you next time.